Thanks, Fiona, and thanks, Jane, so much for the opportunity to come and share this time and space to think through these issues. I really appreciate it. So, as Fiona said, I've come to this research as a historian working as part of a team on a larger project on child refugees and Australian internationalism from 1920 to the present. My part of this project focuses on visual representations of displaced children, to explore in different visual modes at different times how child refugees have been constructed and imagined. In doing this, I want to examine the culturally and historically specific meanings and narratives that are attached to visual depictions of and by displaced children. Working in Australia on refugee history and on visual sources, the dehumanisation of people seeking asylum and links to visualisation are inescapable. In Savendraji's phrase of yesterday, it is about the conspicuous politics of non-visibility. And particular events in 2001 cemented this approach in the context of a federal election campaign. It was one that featured issues of displaced people, refugees and asylum seekers alongside the spectre of terrorism after the attacks in the United States on 11th of September. Specifically in terms of people seeking asylum in Australia, 433 Afghan asylum seekers were rescued by the Norwegian ship MV Tampa in August 2001, and a protracted saga ensued when the Australian government refused to allow the Tampa entry into Australian waters, and Special Air Service troops boarded the vessel. The day after the federal election was called, on the 6th of October, the Children Overboard incident occurred, and on the 19th of October, the boat known as Civex sunk, in which 353 people seeking asylum died. The election campaign included then Prime Minister John Howard's infamous statement linking border security to refugees. He said, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come." While there are many implications of these events, particularly in terms of the offshore processing of people seeking asylum and media access to this, in terms of our focus for this conference, the Children Overboard incident is critical for highlighting the intersection of visual representations, specifically photographs, and the construction of people seeking asylum as non-human. And yesterday, Faye spoke about photographers' response to this image, and I want to look at it from a slightly different angle. Significantly, as Laura Briggs notes, representational practices and practical actions are simultaneously symbolic and material, affecting individual lives and culture broadly through shaping discursive spaces. So the creation and the use of photographs of asylum-seeking adults and children was at the centre of the Children Overboard controversy, and some of you will be quite familiar with this. This unfolded when a small wooden vessel known as Civ 4, carrying 233 people seeking asylum, was intercepted by HMAS Adelaide when the boat entered Australian waters. Uncaptioned photographs taken by Navy personnel to document their work were released by the government to the Parliamentary Press Gallery. That's one of the images on the left. These were then provided as evidence that children were being thrown overboard. These were not the type of people the Prime Minister said he wanted in Australia. The photographs were, in fact, images of the boat sinking and Navy personnel rescuing asylum seekers. Later, evidence given to the Senate committee inquiry into the event was given by Mr Brian Humphreys, the Director General of Communication Strategies at the Department of Defence, and he explained that he was told to ensure that there were no personalising or humanising images taken of people seeking asylum. Here we see clear directives as to what photographs should be taken, how they should be used, narrative meanings attached to them, and significantly, the desire not to personalise or humanise people seeking asylum. We know from this history, and as Robert Dixon has said, in the conduct and representations of public life, words and images matter. Words and images used by politicians and the media have the power to actively constitute people's feelings and opinions, and hence their actions. One recent academic examination of Australian national newspaper front pages that depict people seeking asylum identified dehumanising patterns which the researchers argued defined an impossibility for any political discussion. And while media representations predominate in determining how we see refugees, Terence Wright argues that critical analysis of these images has received little direct attention. Scholars have identified a number of visual tropes used in depicting refugees in the public sphere, such as refugees in large groups as a, quote, sea of humanity, and in other cases, representations of refugees, closely following Christian iconography, particularly the Madonna and Child. These representations have been deemed to hold considerable power in producing authentic and truthful understandings of refugees. Lisa Melky argues that transnational standardised representational practices exist in humanitarian organisations and in the media more broadly, and that they ultimately function to silence refugees. But what of images created and circulated by displaced people themselves? What voices and silences can we read in their images? In light of this, I'm interested in researching historical cases of people publicly identifying themselves as refugees or former refugees through photographs. This led me to using hashtags, I was a refugee, I am a refugee, to search for posts on Instagram. From here, I have a small collection of people who have used photographs of themselves as children to primarily tell their stories of forced migration, to narrate their lives, as well as engage in discussions about the politics of the present. I want to suggest that people using photographs of themselves in the environment of social media can be seen to connect photographs related to one moment of forced movement that they were directly involved in to present cases of forced migration and sometimes debates about refugees. This appears to be done so as a form of political engagement and carried out through the lens of compassion and humanity. From a historian's perspective, we need to think critically and carefully as to links made between different cases of forced displacement, and we also need to account for the general absence of refugees in historical scholarship. Individuals publicly displaying personal photographs on social media produces contemporary images that historians should be attentive to, but we don't yet have an established methodology for reading them. In this way, I want to argue that childhood photographs collated and exhibited in these spaces should be read as prompts for political and social action in the present. This invites a particular type of spectatorship in an everyday social space, of social media, which points to ongoing experiences of forced displacement and calls attention to the politics of the present. In doing this, both past and present refugees are actively constituted as human. I'm thinking about Sharon's keynote and also the photographic portraits that Annie showed yesterday. I think these Instagram posts might also be seen as using faces to claim a sense of dignity and humanity. So briefly thinking about Instagram as a public space, it was launched in 2010 and is an online mobile and photo and video sharing and social networking service. In June this year, Instagram reported 500 million active users with 300 million using the service daily. I think it is a site we can think of as a global public space, which creates the possibility for a range of voices to speak and possibly even to be heard. On Instagram, connections are made through hashtags and @user connections, and emoticons can contribute to the effective context created. So this is what Instagram says about itself. It's a fun and quirky way to share your life with friends through a series of pictures. Snap a photo with your mobile phone, choose a filter, transform it into a memory and keep it around forever. In contrast, most of the photos that I'm looking at here aren't ones taken on a digital camera. They were taken with pre-digital technology but have been digitised to be shared online. And within this, hashtags are a way to categorise and collate information online. Hashtags were first used in 2007, formally adopted by Twitter in 2009 and by Instagram in 2011. Hashtags on Instagram have become more of linguistic style rather than as conversation or what has been termed as creating ad hoc publics on Twitter. But turning to the photographs themselves, so as I mentioned, this is just the start of a collection of the hashtag I was a refugee. But I've used I was a refugee and I am a refugee to locate images. And today I just want to talk about posts by two individuals, one briefly and another one in more detail. And this is part of my general search for a sound methodology in working with these materials. But I think what's crucial to consider is that these images cannot be adequately read without the text that accompanies them. But in practice and in daily use, in many cases, the images often are. As in this environment, there's no accompanying text, but as I'll show you later, there is a lot of text that surrounds them. And this made me think about Susie and David speaking about the importance of captions and framing those images. I'm also working on how to characterise the nature of these images in that physical photographic objects have been transformed into digital ones. It's almost the reverse of the Instagram definition of snap a photo with your mobile and then transform the image into a memory. In these cases, memories and physical objects are digitised, manipulated and narrated through Instagram. So this is just one example that's a Canadian one that I want to just mention briefly. This is from the Ninja Stylist. And she lives in Canada and was a refugee from Vietnam. And I just thought this is a very good example. She speaks at a local university of what happens to the image when it becomes a digital one, and the collection of images that she has used there. And the way she is framing this and framing her talk that she's giving to the university. And she says, "Today I speak as a 4-year-old me, vulnerable, and share my version of my family's survival story." She returned to the university the following year, and this is another kind of example of the work people do involved in a photograph of herself today with a photograph of her in a refugee camp, and putting those images together in this, collating them and then sharing them in the online environment. And I think we see with the use of hashtags at the end of her description, "I was a refugee, boat people," then a whole series of hashtags relating to her work as a hairstylist, and then locating her in a particular place or places, Canada and Vietnam. I think we see with this use of hashtags the constellation of possible identity categories and thinking about the range of avenues that she wants to share this, the range of people she wants to speak to. This is just a brief summary of the totals in terms of the hashtags. So the ones I've been looking at, I'm not wanting to suggest that there's a global phenomenon of people using these randomly, to share their stories. So there's a very small number of posts, and some of these are quite specifically Australian ones, and like Justice for Refugees is one that's had recent rise in use after protests in Canberra last week. And then some have a whole range of things. The hashtag boat people has a lot of people who enjoy boating and taking photographs of themselves on boats with small amounts of clothing. So these numbers, I'm not wanting to suggest are totally watertight, but just an indication of what's there. So this is the example that I wanted to talk about in a little more detail. And this is a screenshot from Instagram user Alicia0308's page. She has a public account, and that's how I'm able to see these images. I haven't blanked out faces, as sometimes people do, particularly in published articles, but I have been thinking and worrying about the ethical implications of using these types of images in a scholarly context. Some scholars examining the use of photographs on social media have made a distinction between the function that photographs on and offline serve, classifying offline photographs as about representation and remembering, while online photographs being solely about communication. Others suggest this distinction between these functions doesn't hold, and I would agree with that. But nonetheless, I think it's useful to consider what is being communicated via images and words in the digital realm. This is particularly salient when considering the hashtags and descriptions that are part of the social media space. As this screenshot shows, if you look in the top right-hand corner, you can see a photograph which is of Alicia as a 2-year-old, and it is part of an array of photographs which could be read as representing and constructing herself in the digital public sphere of Instagram. So if we look at this photo in a bit more detail, you can see the caption that has been provided here. She says, "This is me, I am a refugee. I was given a chance to come to Australia by the Fraser government as a child." She posted this during the Let Them Stay series of political action that occurred early in 2016, which really had a strong emphasis on the image of babies. These protests and political action occurred following a High Court ruling which found offshore detention to be legal and supported the return of 267 asylum seekers who were on the Australian mainland for medical treatment to be returned to Nauru. The political campaign around Let Them Stay really focused on images of children. And these are just some examples. The Human Rights Law Centre, this was the approach to focus on the 37 children who were in Australia and who had been born to people seeking asylum, that this legal case was affecting their return to Nauru. And generally speaking, I think there are political implications on this focus on children in political campaigns and constructing the nature of a response. It can be problematic in terms of creating hierarchies of innocence in which children are positioned as absolutely innocent, fully deserving of pity and care, while adults are erased or figured as not worthy of the same degree of care and sympathy. Susan Moller has argued that since the feminist movement of the 1970s, children rather than women are the public emblems of goodness and purity. Children are the moral referent. But if we return back to this particular Instagram post, we can see the invocation of childhood innocence. And a particular identity is being created through words and images. A refugee past is being linked to the politics of the present. A demand is being made in a similar way to a letter written directly to the Prime Minister. This way is through the @TurnbullMalcolm username. But it is visual and using an image, which I would assume to be an important photograph, and sharing it publicly as a part of a broader public conversation and political movement. We see this photograph again. In this montage, we see more of the surrounds revealed around the sleeping child and the text explaining that this was everything my parents had to their name. It's accompanied by smaller photographs which are of Alicia and her mother at different times visiting the captain of the ship that rescued them when they escaped from Vietnam. Social media and the spaces it provides are significant in facilitating reconnections between refugees and those who assisted them. Anne Nguyen is a PhD student on our project, and she, as part of her work, is examining Facebook groups that have formed around rescue boats and refugee camps in her research on Vietnamese refugees in Australia. And she's looking at these spaces of social media as community-driven practices of memorialisation. The narrative and meaning provided through the series of hashtags is significant in terms of what is emphasised. I came by boat, he saved our lives, opened his heart to us, humans for humanity, truly beautiful man, fear did not rule on that day, love shone through, forever grateful. So here we see movement by boat as well as emotions and attention being placed on the idea of humanity. The final Instagram post is one made in response to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, Peter Dutton's comments made on Sky News in the context of a recent federal election campaign. He said that if the refugee intake was increased, that the refugees coming to Australia would be innumerate and illiterate in their own language as well as English, and they would perform this amazing task of taking Australian jobs whilst also languaging in unemployment queues and on Medicare. But this photo Alicia posted is a direct response to this and the political election campaign. In doing so, she didn't post a current family photo or any other image, but one when she was a child with her parents and siblings and her father in an academic gown, and asked, so I guess my family is one of those dumb, illiterate refugee families who come and steal jobs or languish on the dole queue, Mr. Dutton. Anthropologist Barbara Harrison has distinguished a shift from personal photography's links with memory and commemoration to pictures as a form of identity formation in the present-day use. In these specific instances, we can see a convergence of personal and family identity along with commemoration and public remembering. In theorising digital photography, Jose van Dyck said, personal photographs are increasingly pulled out of shoeboxes to be used as public signifiers. The public signification here, through the words and hashtags accompanying it, is one of political engagement, of family history and the desire to promote ideals of humanity and compassion. In the Australian context of dehumanising people seeking asylum, and with images often understood to silence refugees, these public visual statements are vital ones. So as a spectator of these images and from a historian's perspective, I'm still considering how best to read them, but I see them as functioning in a different way to other images of children, particularly those in the humanitarian realm, because of the way they are framed by the creator, who is the child within the image. We could see posting digital photographs on Instagram as part of a contemporary condition in which the self becomes the centre of a virtual universe and individuals articulate their identity as social beings by documenting their lives photographically and participating in practices of communal photography. While the ways in which these particular formerly displaced people have used their photographs fits within this pattern, personal histories of displacement are linked to the demands for compassion and appeals to humanity. And these are the basis of these particular public interventions that I think we should not lose sight of.